The Lewisburg Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers.
I have known Rebecca Goldstein for many years, and she is just incapable of writing anything that is not unputdownable and spellbinding. Nor does it matter whether it is philosophy or a novel. To pick up a book by Rebecca is to enter a new world, a world that will educate you even as it inspires you, that will leave you amazed that she can pack so many new thoughts into such a concise space. Whether it is 36 arguments for the existence of God, the Dark Sister, Maslow's properties of light, or the mind-body problem, understanding Gödel for the first time, or grappling with Plato and Spinoza on equal footing, Rebecca's world will absorb you and thrill you in a way few others can. What kind of mysterious literary force is it that so transfixes you? In point of fact, it is probably a gift that Rebecca has had from the time she was quite young, and that she developed even as she was graduating summa cum laude from Barnard College, taking a PhD at Princeton, and teaching and winning fellowships and honors at all the best places, both in this country and abroad. Among those prestigious prizes, and of course brevity is going to prevent me from listing all of them, and awards she has won for her work have been a Guggenheim Fellowship, a fellowship at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard, and a Montgomery Fellowship at Dartmouth. She has won the Whiting Award, the National Jewish Book Award, the prestigious MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Award, and only the third philosopher to do so, the others being two men, John Rawls and John Searle. And then in 2015, she capped her career by being presented with the National Humanities Medal in Washington by President Obama himself. No mean feat. It gives me great pleasure this evening, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce to you as the second speaker in the Hunter College Writing Center's Great Thinkers series, one of this country's truly seminal and original minds, currently visiting professor of philosophy and English at New York University, my good friend Rebecca Goldstein, who was originally going to be late because she had a late class, but showed up very punctually. Rebecca?
Thank you. Thanks, Louis. I had a cab driver who like bat out of hell. I mean, just it was incredible. I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about my checkered career and why I write the kinds of books that I do. I always somehow, when I start talking about my career, go back to the fact that seems to me to have been important, which was that I was born into a quite religious household. And my father was a refugee from Poland, and we were extremely religious, and most of the family remains. In fact, all of the family remains religious. Among my awards, you didn't mention my Freedom from Religion award from the what is it? It's the I can't remember the name of the award. Free Thought Heroine from the Freedom from Religion Foundation and others of this sort. So I haven't remained with the beliefs into which I was born. And in fact, that seems to me somehow to have, if there's anything that explains anybody's life narrative, to me that seems to be the most pertinent fact. I was just always baffled by what it was that everybody claimed to know. And I was always wondering how they could possibly know what they claimed to know. And that is a fundamental question in philosophy, right? It's the basis of epistemology. What is knowledge and what does it require? And are there any limits to knowledge, which is a question that has continued to interest me throughout my career. And I think my fascination, I didn't know it was epistemology that was fascinating me, but it emerged very, very early. And I was constantly asking people in my family when they would say various things, how do you know that? How do you know that? And I was never happy with the answers that I got. It always seemed to me that they were presuming the very thing that I was questioning. I wasn't getting anywhere. And so I started to just haunt the public library. And my parents, fortunately, were quite liberal in nothing else but in the books that I was allowed to read. They pretty much gave me free rein. So, for example, when I brought home, at a certain point, Bertrand Russell's Why I Am Not a Christian, they were perfectly fine with that. They didn't care if we weren't Christian, they didn't care. But in fact, Bertrand Russell there goes through all of the standard arguments for the existence of God and destroys them. And, one of them being the argument that seemed to me perhaps the most cogent of all the arguments, the moral arguments for God's existence, which is, we need God in order to ground morality. Or, how are we to know what's right and wrong unless there's a God? And Bertrand Russell pretty much, he actually uses, as I later learned, an ancient argument, an argument by Plato from the Euthyphro, to undermine that argument. And I thought that was very interesting, and it was such a good decimation of these arguments that worked on a Jewish kid too, and but I was so I was very, very drawn to the library and particularly to science. It seemed to me that was the one place in which, when I asked, how do they know that? One could get answers, how they knew that there was evidence, there were theories, they tested the theories, and that seemed terrific to me. In fact, probably one of the most important events that I had in my childhood was I took out this book called Our Friend the Atom. And I learned that the world out there was entirely different from the way it seemed in here, that somehow or other these scientists who had become my heroes somehow were able to get outside of our experience and know about these invisible constituents of matter, these things whirling around. And so although the world seemed to be full of colors and sounds and smells and solid objects, no, it wasn't like that at all. It was full of empty space. Everything was full of empty space and these atoms whirling around. I thought, it's incredible. I was 7 when I read that book. This is amazing. And I formed this huge ambition for me, this little girl. Someday I'm going to meet a scientist. I didn't think someday maybe I'll be a scientist. That was like unimaginable, off the radar. Maybe someday I'll meet a scientist. And then I'm going to ask him, assumed of course it was a him, I'm going to ask him, how do you know this? How do you get outside of our own experience and know what the world is really like? And so anyway, that was my childhood, and it was important that somehow I was going to get to college. I went to a high school where we were not encouraged to go to college. We were encouraged to get married as soon as possible. And in fact, I was engaged and did get married. I was engaged before I left high school, did get married the first time. As soon as I had finished one year of college. And and I did get to college. I got to Barnard. Thank goodness for those SATs, because I was completely uneducated. I went to a school that was not educating me. I knew some things from playing hooky all the time and going to the library. And then I majored in physics. That was the thing to do, right? I wanted to, my ambitions grew a little bit. I didn't want to meet a scientist. I wanted to be a scientist. And my professors were very, very encouraging, and I loved studying physics. And I went through my undergraduate career as a physics major and had, in fact, applied to graduate schools in physics. It was my senior year. And I was taking, and got in where I wanted to go, and I was taking a course in quantum mechanics. And it was a very frustrating experience because quantum mechanics is a very weird theory, and it's hard to know how to interpret it. It's hard to know what it's saying about our world. And there was a view that was very popular when I was in graduate school. It's now waned, which was quantum mechanics is showing us something about physics. It's showing us that it's not really descriptive, because the world that it's describing, it just, we don't know how to interpret it. There are all sorts of paradoxes in quantum mechanics. So maybe science is really not a description. It's an instrument for making predictions, an instrument for making predictions of future experiences, and it doesn't expand our view of the world. It doesn't expand our ontology, which is a philosophical world. I've already given you epistemology, that's the study of knowledge. Ontology is the study of reality. It is comes from the Greek word ontos, which means being. And epistemology comes from the Greek for knowledge, episteme. So anyway, this physics professor I had in this advanced course in quantum mechanics, every time I would go to him and say, but what is the world like? I mean, because that's why I had gone into physics, right? Because I was just so impressed that these physicists were able to break out of subjectivity and tell us what's objectively true. Every time I would say, but what is it saying about the world? He would say, you're not allowed to ask that question. Now, I am a very patient person. I actually have become less patient as I get older, but I used to be a very patient person. But if there's one question that just makes me lose all patience, it's somebody telling me that you're not allowed to ask a certain question. I just see red when I'm told that you're not allowed to ask a certain question. That reminds me too much of my religious past, where I was constantly being told, you're not allowed to ask that question. And here was a physicist, right? My highest ideal, telling me you're not allowed to ask this question, shut up and calculate. That was, and I mean, calculate, that's easy. Anybody can calculate, but try to figure out, what the world is like. That's that's the adventure, right? That's the incredible adventure. That's why I had to, work so hard to get myself to college. Anyway, I kept going back to the professor. I was a bit of a pain. And arguing like Einstein told us what the world is like. Einstein said that's what the whole point of physics is, and that was wonderful. Einstein corrected all of our false intuitions. We think that simultaneity is absolute, and Einstein let reality answer us back and say, no, it's not. We have to correct that. Simultaneity is not absolute. There's not space. There's not time. There's space-time. That's amazing. We can break out of the way things seem. Our most fundamental intuitions about space and time and identity, and find out what reality is really like. And so, I mean, he just got so sick of me, this professor, that he finally said to me, why don't you go talk to the philosophers? They ask these kinds of meaningless questions. And I would love to find this guy and give him a kiss or something, because that was a great piece of advice I got. Mind you, I had already been accepted to graduate school in physics. So I went to the physics department and I asked around, like, whom should I speak to? And it was Columbia. I was at Barnard. All my physics courses were taken at across the street, as we used to say. All my math and physics was at Columbia. And I asked people, whom should I speak to? And everybody said, Sidney Morgenbesser. Does anybody here know Sidney? Yes. So Sidney was an amazing person. And I'm very glad that was the person to whom I was sent. Sidney, he was a character. He was, he doesn't have a great publishing record. He has about the same publishing record as Socrates, which is the null set, right? I mean, nothing really, few things, right? But Sidney was a master of philosophical dialogue, and that's the way, philosophy began. It began in dialogue. And he, everything you said, he would question, and you may mean this by it, you may mean that by this. If you mean A, well, that's trivial, that's a tautology. If you mean B, well, that's false. And, just parsing everything. He did it to himself, which is why he could never publish anything. But anyway, Sidney, I went to see him maybe the first time we spoke for about 2 hours, and the next time maybe 3 hours. And he was the one who told me, he said, I think you're interested in philosophy. And I just from speaking to him, it was like amazing. The guy, it was just the kind of language that I had been looking for. And so I wrote to the various schools that had accepted me in physics, and I said, I want to change to philosophy. And there were 3 schools that I had written to, and 2 of them said, what are you, crazy? I mean, you've demonstrated some ability in physics. What makes you think that you can do philosophy? But the 3rd one said, well, come down and speak to us. And that was Princeton. And we'll see. And so, I met with some professors, and they accepted me. Anyway, so I did philosophy of science, and it was very, very interesting, and I loved it. I don't quite know how I started writing novels. It's one of my beliefs that the last talk I gave was called "Why Are Philosophers So Annoying?" And one of the reasons I think philosophers are so annoying is that we're all philosophers. Everybody is interested in the fundamental questions of philosophy. It's impossible, as long as the basic needs of existence, of survival are met, you start thinking, what is this all about? What are we? What's the universe? What's our relationship with the universe? What am I supposed to be doing with this life? What's in store for me? These are philosophical questions. What's the right way to act? These are what's knowledge? What do we know? How do I know that I know what I know? These are philosophical questions, and one or the other is going to occur to a person who has any kind of reflectiveness or leisure to reflect, and so I've always been convinced of that, and I've always been convinced that it would be a good thing to find a way of writing that could bring as many people into the conversation as possible, because that's also very, very important. If philosophers just talk to philosophers, we all share certain assumptions and presuppositions, and you want to bring as many people into the discussion because what seems obvious, so intuitively obvious to one person, can be very, very questionable from another person's point of view. So, for example, women. When I first entered philosophy, especially philosophy of science, I was always the only woman at the table. I'm still, unfortunately, quite often the only woman at the table. It gets extremely annoying and very tiresome. But when you're, but things have changed in philosophy somewhat. It's still not great. But just bringing women into the conversation has caused certain assumptions that were just obvious to all the privileged white males who were at the seminar table to have to actually defend these assumptions. and that were invisible to them, right? Because, when it's very, very fundamental, you just don't see them. We all have assumptions like that. That's why it's all very important to talk to people who, don't share your assumptions. So I also thought for that reason, it would be good to find a way of writing to bring as many people into the conversation as possible, and also to share the riches of this incredible tradition in philosophy. It goes all the way back 2,500 years to Plato and to the ancient Greeks. So I very early on tried to experiment with different ways of writing philosophy, and I'm still doing it. So am I really a novelist? No, I'm not. I'm very glad that people think I'm a novelist, but I'm a philosopher trying to reach as many people as possible, and also a philosopher who believes that philosophy is firmly embedded in life, in all of our lives. And so by sort of animating this in characters and in plots, I love novels, but I love to read them. But for me, it's a means to an end. When I write novels, it's a means to an end. I feel like an imposter as a novelist. When I meet real novelists like Catherine Voss, who's sitting right here, I sometimes feel like, I'm an imposter. I'm a philosopher who uses the form of the novel and other forms as well to try to bring the riches of philosophy. I mean, this extraordinary tradition, which I would argue has gotten us very, very far. That it's often complained that philosophers, never discover anything. That there's no progress in philosophy. You can still read Plato and Aristotle. So where's the progress? And I think this is a huge error. This is a fallacy, and that in certain ways, the progress that philosophy has made, we see with it. It's been so assimilated into our minds that we don't see it. We see with it. Which brings me to my last book, Plato at the Googleplex, Why Philosophy Won't Go Away. So I yet another experiment with writing philosophy. It's not a novel, but it is. It has novelistic elements to it. I'm still experimenting with the right way to do this. Another thing that I'm very committed to is philosophy, although it's a very intellectual field, is also filled with questions that are and can help to be extremely emotional. And I think that that's important. I don't believe in that these are two separate and conflicting capacities, the intellect and the emotion. Like one of my heroes, Spinoza, I think that the intellect and the emotions are inextricably connected with one another, and that as we make intellectual progress, our emotions change, and that emotions always have certain propositional aspects to them, which is why they can be corrected. Anyway, so I'm always in trying to find the right ways to write philosophy, and it depends on the questions that I'm taking up. I'm always experimenting with different forms of writing it. So in Plato at the Googleplex, the way that book came around, I love Plato. Plato was first of all, he was a great, great writer. He's the greatest literary artist in the Western philosophical canon. And he also is the founder of philosophy as we know it. What does one mean by that? Did he have all the answers? No. And Plato was the last person to think that he had all the answers. He was constantly questioning himself. He was constantly overturning theses that he tried out in one dialogue, and he would take them back in another dialogue. So, the whole idea of the Platonic doctrine is, to me, an absurdity. I think it would just make Plato cringe. For Plato, and I think this is why he used the dialogue form, philosophy is a kind of art of questioning, But it was more than that. When we say that Plato was the founder of philosophy, and if we go as far as Alfred North Whitehead, philosopher and mathematician, as to say that all of Western philosophy consists of footnotes to Plato. I mean, that really sounds terrible, like a man 2,500 years ago, and we're just writing his footnotes. Where's the progress in that? That would be horrible. But what Whitehead meant by that is not that Plato had all the answers, but he asked all the right questions. I mean, he had an incredible nose for philosophy. He's figured out the essence of the philosophical question, which can be raised in every area of human inquiry and interest and concern. So for every area in which we're interested or that we make knowledge claims, there's the corresponding philosophy of that field. There's philosophy of science, philosophy of history, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of language, philosophy of art, philosophy of religion, philosophy of knowledge, epistemology, metaphysics, philosophy of conduct, moral philosophy, political philosophy. I'm leaving out a lot of things, right? But it's, actually now a very new field, philosophy of technology, philosophy of artificial intelligence. Whatever field that we create and that we're interested in, there's always the corresponding philosophy of that thing. And did I mention philosophy of language? Did I mention that in my little? No, philosophy of language, really important. Philosophy of art. Look, just anything that we're interested in. There is that field, the philosophy of that thing. Plato managed to almost lay out the entire landscape of philosophy for all of these different areas. He spotted and he raised and he articulated the philosophical question, the central philosophical question related to that field. It's as if he raised up the whole submerged continent of Atlantis, which is a really apt metaphor because the first allusion to the continent of Atlantis came from Plato, all right, in his dialogue, the Timaeus, also again in the Critias. Anyway, I'm very interested. I mean, this is very interesting to me. This man Plato, about whom we know almost nothing, and it's not just that he lived 2,500 years ago. It's that he doesn't reveal himself in his writings like Shakespeare doesn't, right? That we know a lot about Socrates because Socrates is a major figure, and 25 of the 26 dialogues that Plato wrote, and we have all the dialogues that he wrote, unlike Aristotle, where a lot was lost. We have everything that Plato wrote. How do we know? Because no commentator, no historical commentator through the ages ever referred to anything of Plato's that we don't have, and they were constantly, discussing him. We have it all. So in 25 of those 26 dialogues, Socrates is a major figure. And so we know a lot about Socrates, and we know a lot about Alcibiades, who we know about anyway, but he's also a figure in one of Plato's dialogues. In the Symposium, Plato makes alive and brings to us all these different figures, but we never see him, right? Just like Shakespeare, we never really see Shakespeare. And so, which is why there are so many theories about Shakespeare. So anyway, Plato, who was he, and how could he have done what he did, and why was it in the context of being an ancient Greek was that important? Of course it was important. It had to be important because the ancient Greeks were amazing, right? They're still amazing us, right? They created Western civilization. They created the beginnings of science and of abstract mathematics. Euclid, who was born 37 years after Plato died, so the method by proof. They created philosophy, democracy, what else? History, the study of history, as opposed to just annals, chronicles, but the study of history in Herodotus and Thucydides. Besides all of this timeless art, right? The art, the architecture, the sculpture, the literary largesse that we get from the Greeks, the drama. They created tragedy, right? The art of tragedy, great poetry, comedy. Anyway, they're amazing, right? So, and also philosophy. And then here's this Plato. So who creates philosophy. I wanted to go back and try to solve this problem. What was it about the ancient Greeks? How did this happen? Thank you so much. That was one reason, and I wanted to get closer to him. I'm always, when I love a thinker, I want to somehow get closer to them and know them from the inside and know why were they interested in the questions that they were interested in? What was it that called? There are just so many questions, but so what makes a brilliant person zero in on a particular kind of question? I want to do that for Plato. I mean, it's just a crazy idea, really, because, I mean, we lived 2,500 years ago. The Greeks are very, very remote from us, and he's the most remote of all the Greeks. So how do we, of the famous Greeks, about whom we know anything at all, so how could I do, that was one of the motivations. But the other thing was, and I'm probably going to end with this, so you'll have time for questions, because that's always my favorite part, right? Because that's what philosophy is all about. Something that's recently happened in contemporary American culture and to some extent in England as well, is that some of our most high-profile scientists have taken to attacking, of all things, philosophy. And some of these people are very good friends of mine, very good friends of mine. So I don't know if I should name names, but I will. Because they've done it. They've been very public about this. So Neil deGrasse Tyson, for example, Bill Nye just recently came out in an interview saying that, attacking philosophy. And Richard Dawkins. Oh God, who's the guy I really go after in my book? Krauss. I can't remember his first name right. Lawrence Krauss. Yes, a lot of these, people were on the same, I don't know, kind of lecture tours, right? This sort of what I call organized non-religion, organized anti-religion. And who am I leaving out? There are more. Oh, even Stephen Hawking has attacked philosophy. And I thought, what is going on here? We have so many problems. We who embrace reason, who think that it's a good thing to be reasonable, that's how we make progress. That there are so many forces of irrationality and anti-reason that are threatening us at the moment. Why should scientists go after philosophy, right? Is it a deep misunderstanding of what philosophy is trying to do? Yes, I think it is. What most of the criticisms are is that philosophers are not scientists. They're not helping with the scientific enterprise. First of all, that's historically false. Philosophers often do help with the scientific enterprise. In fact, most of the major sciences have, in fact, all of the major sciences have emerged out of philosophy. It was the philosophers who were first asking these questions and putting them on the table and racking their brains. And then a methodology comes along, an empirical methodology that allows us to make some progress with these questions and push forward. And once they become susceptible to scientific treatment, you can really push them forward. But it's actually, so physics was once natural philosophy, so physics and cosmology came out of philosophy, psychology came out of philosophy, linguistics came out of philosophy, logic, formal logic came out of philosophy. But that's not the important thing, actually. Philosophy doesn't exist in order to be a helpmate to science, and philosophy certainly isn't trying to compete with science. If it was, philosophy would be as absurd and as futile as these scientists think it is, because we have something that allows us to make scientific progress. It's called science, and it's an extraordinary conglomeration of many different cognitive talents and methods. Different scientists call on different methodologies, different cognitive abilities. So I know theoretical physicists, who can't observe they're not good observers. They don't see what's in front of them, but they're very good theorizers, and they can make mathematical models of things. And then we've got the scientists who are very good observers, and the scientists who are anal compulsive collectors of data. And we've got all different kinds of scientists and all different kinds of cognitive means and all different methodologies at play. But what science does is brings this all together and allows us to somehow prod reality into answering us back if we're getting it wrong. That's the amazing thing that science did. I was right back in college when my professor was telling me just shut up and calculate. I was right. That's not what science is about. Science is about trying to prod reality. Say, look, we think it's like this. We think simultaneity is absolute. Correct us if we're wrong, and we come up with some kind of experiment, some kind of something to prod reality. Say, no, you're wrong. Your intuitions are wrong. They could be fundamentally wrong. You could be wrong about space and time and causality and identity. And that's what science does. And that's incredible that we've managed to do. Or, you think that you're some kind of very special thing that's separate from the rest of the animal kingdom. There's no connection between you at all, right? Well, it turns out that's not right, right? The theory of evolution has shown us that that's not right. A fundamental and emotionally fraught intuition that we have was corrected by reality, and that's what science is able to do. Philosophy doesn't do that. Philosophy does something else. If philosophy tries to compete with science in terms of that, it's going to fail. And so part of this problem that I think some of people are having is they don't know what it is that philosophy is trying to do. So I thought one of the things I wanted to do in writing a book about Plato and going back to Plato, who uncovered this kind of question, the philosophical question, was one, to show how far we've gotten from Plato, that so many of his intuitions, as brilliant as he was, we now know to be wrong, including moral intuitions that he had. We now know him to be wrong. And so to show that philosophy doesn't go away, it stays with us, but it also makes progress, I thought it would be really interesting to bring Plato back into our day and to be in dialogue with us. Plato wrote dialogues. That would be an interesting thing to try to do. So interspersed in the expositional questions I take up there, which have to do with, why did the Greeks discover philosophy? What was it? I think I came to an answer. What was it that primed the Greeks to discover philosophy? Interspersed with those chapters, and also Plato and what he thought and how he changed his mind, because he constantly changed his mind. That's really the reason I love him. Interspersed with that are these dialogues where Plato comes back. He's on book tour. That's the shtick. Plato is timeless, right? He is timeless, so he's still with us. He could still be on book tour. And he's on book tour, and he gets into dialogues with us, with people like us. And the first place he goes is the Googleplex in Mountain View, California, the headquarters of Google International, where they do invite authors to give talks, authors at Google. I've been there 3 times now. And so that's the first place he goes, and he gets into a conversation with his media escort, very concrete woman, not interested in philosophy, she thinks, at all. and a software engineer who believes that he can create a search engine to answer all of the questions that, ethical questions that Plato had first posed. He calls it the Ethical Answer Search Engine, acronym EASE. You can answer all these questions with ease through crowdsourcing. Actually, one of the tricks about writing philosophy is if you want to argue about against something, you have to make it the very best argument you possibly can. It's no good to argue against a flimsy straw man. I mean, that's you don't. That doesn't show anything. So if you want to refute something, you have to make it the very best argument you possibly can. And so while I was making up this dialogue, and I had this software engineer saying that we can answer all these questions with ease, right, E-A-S-E, right, I convinced myself for a while. I mean, I really did construct this search engine, this idea for a search engine of crowdsourcing, which I thought, oh yeah, right, this could work. It couldn't, and Plato was able to show how it couldn't work. One of the things I wanted to do in each of these dialogues, in order to show the continuity, show how far we've come, Plato couldn't think of crowdsourcing or search engines, show how far we've come, but that Plato is still relevant in terms of the kinds of questions he asks, and also he had a very good nose for what is not the right answer. That when somebody would propose something, he could knock it down. That you haven't understood the question yet. So one of the ways I tried to do this was to bring passages from the real Plato, from the dialogues, the 26 dialogues, and to interweave them into our dialogues, but in such a I hoped seamless way that if I didn't footnote it, you wouldn't know. And I constantly footnoted it so that you would know I didn't want to plagiarize from Plato. In fact, I wanted you to be able to see the continuity. But they fit right into our dialogues, even though we've come so much farther from him. So anyway, so that's what the dialogues. I just thought of them as a way of kind of enlivening the discussion and, sort of dramatizing the way in which these questions stay with us, although we've often come farther. Plato is constantly being, even the media, he's constantly being educated by non-philosophers. Even the media escort is able to teach him something that blows his mind, that the real Plato had no idea of, and she had no idea that she knew something of such philosophical importance. So I just thought, I'll do this, and I mean, there are 5 of them, so Googleplex, I think the next place is 92nd Street Y, and he's on a panel of child-rearing experts discussing how to raise our children. Plato talks about that a tremendous amount, especially in his Republic, one of his most famous dialogues. And the other panelists are somebody who's, I call her the warrior mom, and loosely based on Amy Chua, and a psychoanalyst, loosely based on Melanie Klein, and Plato, and they're discussing how to raise the perfect child, and so many of the things he has to say are very, very relevant to the child-rearing experts coming from a psychoanalyst and from a tiger mom, and so then the next thing I have him do is giving love and sex advice. Plato was extremely interested in eros, in love and sexuality. He didn't write just one dialogue, the Symposium, but 2, the Phaedrus, in which he takes back everything he said in the Symposium. That's what's so wonderful about him. He changes his mind. He never just rests with the answers that he's come to. So anyway, what the shtick is there is that I actually know of a advice columnist, Margot Howard. Do you know Margot? Margot Howard, who is the daughter of 2 very famous, she's the daughter of one famous, Ann Landers, and the niece of another, Dear Abby, and then she went into the family business. She gives advice. So, and she often goes to consult experts, like whenever she's retired now, but when she used to get philosophical, what she thought were philosophical questions, I was her consultant. So I meet up a bunch of questions people would have nowadays so for example. A graduate student writes that she's in a really hard field. It's very hard to get a job. Her professor is offered to be a professor with benefits. They're both involved with other people, so there's no chance, risk of getting emotionally involved. But he promises, if she gives him what he wants, he'll give her what she wants, which is a good recommendation and wisdom, right? She'll get lots of face time with him. And so what should she do? And so these sorts of questions. Well, Plato actually has an answer. He actually, and it's not the one you would have thought. So what I would do is Margot would answer it, and then she'd say, and now I'm going to consult my philosophical expert, Plato, and hear what he has to say. And what was so interesting was that often Plato gave the much more liberal answer, including to that question, than Margot did. So I think I have 10 of those, and they all come from things he said, right? I'm not making this up whole cloth. I just take out what he's, I'm quoting him. And the situations are different, but the words are applicable. The advice, the intuitions are applicable. The next thing I have him do is to go on cable news and to start to discuss. Plato was no fan of democracy. He worried that there were two things that were corrupting Athenian democracy. Interestingly enough, just listen to this. One was that the Athenian populace, when they went to the Pnyx, the assembly where they voted, they often couldn't tell whether they were voting at the Pnyx or in the theater. They used to also vote what was the best plays. Everything was competition for the Agon. Everything was competition for the Greeks. So they would, the politician who was exciting, who could move them, who could arouse them, who was good theater, would get the votes. And he said, you've got to be able to tell the difference between politics and entertainment when you're in the assembly and when you're in the theater. I don't have to say why he's relevant, right? I don't have to say. The other thing he said that was undermining Athenian democracy was that you have to keep money out of politics. These were the two things about which he warned. And so in his Republic, he said the basic problem of political leadership is how to attract the right leaders, the people who don't do it for selfish reasons, but because they care about the common good. And that is why he said that his guardians, his philosopher kings, not only would they have to have special talents, not only would they have to go through a rigorous training, but they also would not be allowed to own any private property. So the citizens can own private property. They could get rich, but the ones who were thinking about the common good were not allowed to own any private property at all, so that you would attract the people who were doing it for the right reasons, because they cared about the common good. Why did I type that? Oh, yeah. So I bring him to Fox News or something like Fox News, and he gets into a discussion with somebody who's sort of like Bill O'Reilly. I tried to watch Bill O'Reilly. I couldn't. So I got my Bill O'Reilly by way of Stephen Colbert when he was still doing that. But anyway, this is when Plato, who's at first very impressed with American democracy, begins to be a little more worried. And this book was written in, I think, 2013, when I was still fairly optimistic. Anyway, and then the last place I bring him is to Harvard and to a neuroscience lab where he volunteers to have an fMRI, a brain scan, and gets into a philosophical discussion with the two neuroscientists about free will, personal agency, moral responsibility. How has neuroscience and what we've discovered about the brain, which is the mind, how has that impinged on these philosophical problems? And in order to do it, I went and got a brain scan at Harvard, and got into a philosophical discussion with the neuroscientists there. Anyway, so that is like the latest attempt to try to show that we're all interested in this stuff, and that philosophy has made a lot of progress, but as much progress as we make, certainly scientific progress, more philosophical questions are thrown off inevitably. So the more progress we make in science, the more there is for philosophers and all of us to think about. Philosophy isn't not meant just for philosophers. We are the philosophical animals. I think that's what we are. Anyway, I have no idea how long I spoke, probably too long, but thank you. Do we have time for questions?
Thank you, Rebecca. We do have time for a few questions, and I see some prominent scientists, philosophers in the audience. But nevertheless, we'll start with this gentleman right there.
Hi, how are you? Very interesting conversation. So I have a two-part question, which actually is a one question. So how would you define philosophy, and specifically philosophy of science, and how does that differ from science itself? Let's take mathematics, for example. So what is philosophy of mathematics versus mathematics?
Yeah.
The science of mathematics.
Good. So the fundamental question in philosophy of mathematics, which happened to be one that Plato asked, and in the one area in which Platonism is still discussed, is still a viable answer to the philosophical question, is philosophy of mathematics. In fact, the basic fundamental question in philosophy of mathematics is, what are we doing when we're doing mathematics? Mathematics is sui generis. It's very different from other fields of knowledge, including physics, including cosmology, right? Because it's a priori. That's why mathematicians are so inexpensive to hire, right? Mathematicians and philosophers, very inexpensive, both of us, because we don't require laboratories. We don't require, the Hadron Accelerator. We don't require observatories. It's all done in the head. In fact, there's a joke that mathematicians are almost the cheapest professors to hire, because all they require is a blackboard, chalk, and erasers. Philosophers are even cheaper because they don't need the erasers. Okay, so mathematics it's mysterious, right? And that we know these things a priori. I mean, I can prove to you that there is no largest prime number. I didn't go out and check. How do I know that there's not a largest prime number lurking out there, after which there are no more prime numbers, right? And count. But one knows a priori. There's a beautiful proof for why there is no largest prime number. It doesn't depend on going out and checking. So how do the likes of us come to know a priori, to have certain knowledge about infinite matters, we finite creatures? How do I know there's no largest prime number, right, if I just keep going? Or if we make it a project of our species to just keep checking. So are we discovering something? Are there things, numbers, sets? Do they exist out there and we're discovering truths about them a priori? Is it like physics, only about non-spatiotemporal entities? And how exactly do we do that? How do we come to make contact with these spatiotemporal creatures? How do we make contact with them? Or are we making it up as we go along? Are there just certain rules that we have and we follow out the implications of them? And mathematics is a higher form of chess, right? You lay down your rules, they're kind of arbitrary, and then you play the game. Is that what's going on? Or is it something to do with the structure of the mind, as Kant thought? Is it somehow built into the human mind, but there's nothing objectively true about that? So that mathematics is a kind of psychology. We're learning something about the psychology of our mind and what seems intuitively obvious to us, but the Martians would have a completely different mathematics. So you can do mathematics, and you can agree on what mathematics is, and you can, mathematicians who have a completely different philosophical views about what they're doing when they're doing mathematics can all agree on the mathematics, and a proof is a beautiful proof, is an elegant proof, and still will not be able to answer the question is, what is mathematics actually doing? Are we in the business of discovery? Or are we in the business of invention? Or are we in the business of psychology? What is it that we're doing when we do mathematics? You can't answer it mathematically, perhaps. I have one possible counterexample because Kurt Gödel, about whom I wrote a book, Incompleteness, The Proof and Paradox of Kurt Gödel, set out to try to produce a mathematical proof that would answer this meta-mathematical question, this question about mathematics. It's called the incompleteness theorems. He thought that he had proved Platonism, that with this mathematical proof that he had proved Platonism. Of course, people disagree about this. They all agree the mathematics is fantastic. The mathematics works. It's given rise to different branches of mathematics. Model theory and recursion theory all came out of this. But Kurt Gödel did not answer the question he wanted to answer, which is, what are we doing when we do mathematics? And it's hard to see how a mathematical proof, he came closest to doing it. Turing perhaps also came close to doing what are we doing when we do mathematics. For a long time, I believe that Kurt Gödel had answered the meta-mathematical question, that he proved mathematical Platonism. I've since come to doubt that. So, but that's okay. So I could go through every field. I mean, I spoke too long about that, but you wanted about mathematics, so there it is. We can do mathematics, but the philosophical question is, what are we doing when we do mathematics? Are we discovering, or are we making it up? Yes?
Are you ever happy with the answer you get to the question you ask?
Temporarily. Temporarily. The wonderful thing about also being a philosopher is very aggressive. You have to have a thick skin. Because it's extremely argumentative. You put your stuff out there so that you will be attacked. So you can't be too attached to your beliefs, your doctrines. I think that's the beauty of it. So I put forth the best I've got at the moment and wait for the attacks to come. That have, and sometimes I change my mind, and that's fantastic. That's wonderful. That's liberating and enlarging and expansive, and I'm always very grateful to the people who show me I'm wrong. What greater thing can one ask from your comrades?
I'm going to call the gentleman over there, and then before the end, Bear, I want you to give her the largest prime number before the end of the... Go ahead.
The reason that the scientists, Richard Dawkins, and the others aren't happy about philosophy is they think in answering how things work and what they're made of, they're pretending that they've answered the why question. And they haven't. They haven't touched the philosophical question, the why question. So that's why they tend to put down philosophy, because the whole bunch of them think that they've got the answer, but they've got the answer to the how and what, but not the why. Now, my question, and the reason I think is the main philosophical question, is Leibniz's question: why is there something rather than nothing? That's the big one.
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's the main one.
That's
right?
a big one.
That's number one. So when you ask that question, you say, well, what's the answer to that question? Obviously, religion is an answer. There's lots of religions answering that. Or maybe you're an atheist and you say that there is no higher power. Or maybe you're an agnostic and you sit on the fence and you say maybe there is a higher power and maybe there's not. or maybe you're a nihilist, and with Shakespeare you say life is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So it seems to me that once you've gone down that path, you've asked the main question, and you've come up with the 4 main answers, then you can choose which one you want. You want to go to synagogue, you want to go to church, you want to, okay. So then it seems to me, since you want an answer, that you're moving on to the next important question, the question that has cash value, and that's the question of evil. It seems to me philosophy would be doing its job if it asked and tried to answer the question of evil. And
What is evil, or why does evil exist? Which question of evil?
Well, first you have to define it. You have to say what it is.
Sure.
And it seems to me it's obvious that Plato may not have thought it exists. The form of the good was there. Here's what I think Plato's answer to that question is. In Book 1, Socrates and Thrasymachus have a dialogue. And of course, it's well known, Socrates' position, and it's well known that Thrasymachus' position is simply summarized that might makes right. The rule of empire rules, like the American empire. So, and I think Plato never has Socrates overcome Thrasymachus. I think Thrasymachus, because I think that's at the heart of Republic, and I think Thrasymachus wins the argument. So, therefore, the answer to evil is relativity. It's all, even though Plato's the big universal Mr. Forms guy and there's eternal truth, I think Plato, like you said, he's always hiding in the shadows. I think he believed with Thrasymachus that it's all relative, and then them got the gold is them that makes the rules.
Good. So, where do I begin?
Begin with the answer to the first one.
Okay.
No mind, you know.
Why is there something rather than nothing? So you didn't leave out my favorite answer. And one of the wonderful things that philosophy does is that it puts more possible answers on the table. And you didn't you left out what is for me it's not just. So when we say why is there something rather than nothing, it's why is there anything at all? Right? So your question about the first question, how does philosophy of science differ from science? Well, in philosophy of science, what we want are we want to know the laws of nature, right? We would like to know, and we would like to know the final laws of nature. We like to know the final theory. But then there's also the question of, well, why those laws of nature rather than some other laws of nature? Why would it be this theory rather than another? If we get the ultimate theory, is there an answer to that question? Why is that the ultimate, the final theory of everything, and not another question? And that's when we're asking, why is there something rather than nothing? We want to know, why is there a universe at all to be described by science? And why is it these laws of nature, of which we don't yet know the final form, but presumably there is a final form. Why this theory rather than some other? So that's what we're asking about when we ask why is there something rather than nothing. And my favorite answer, which you did not list, is Spinoza's answer. And it was the answer that made Einstein a Spinozist. Einstein always was asked, when he was asked, do you believe in God? Always said, I believe in Spinoza's God, which was very cagey of Einstein to say, because it sounded like he wasn't an atheist. But what is that answer? And it didn't appear on your catalog. It is that, and it also appears in Stephen Hawking's last few paragraphs in A Brief History of Time. It is that if we were to know the final theory, we would not only know the final formulation of the laws of nature, we would know why they have to be the laws of nature, that we would understand why there was only, this is the only possible universe, that this is, the laws of nature explain themselves. That's what Spinoza meant by saying that God and nature are one. They are the causa sui, right? They explain themselves, the Deus sive natura. We usually, the notion of theism that you were presenting there was that God is outside of nature and that he chose these laws and he said let them be. This other view, Spinozist view, which Einstein and Stephen Hawking also has some interest in. Actually, string theorists love this view. Every time I talk about Spinoza to string theorists, they say, I'm a Spinozist, is that it's nature itself, where we only to thoroughly understand it, that explains itself. In that way, nature is godlike. It creates itself. And that is, so we don't know that that's true. It's a good working hypothesis in science. And philosopher, it was only because philosophers were asking this question that this particular alternative came up, the Spinozist alternative. And it happens to be my favorite. I don't like any of the ones that you named.
Rebecca, who was the wag who answered this question by saying, no matter, never mind?
What's mine, no matter, what's matter, never mind. Who was the wag? Who said that? I don't know. Bertrand Russell says it, but I don't think he originated it.
No matter, never mind?
Yeah. No. It's what's matter, never mind.
To his question, they answered,
Oh.
no matter, never mind.
Oh, I see. No matter, never mind.
Anyway, young lady.
Hi, I'm a huge fan of your book. Hi, I'm a huge fan. The mind-body problem is the reason I'm a philosophy major here at Hunter. So thank you. It's really an honor to listen to you. You had mentioned that you were interested in what makes a brilliant person zero in on a type of question. And so you had mentioned that your Jewish identity was what got you into philosophy. And I wonder, that is why, or what made you get into philosophy, but I wonder what types of questions you're interested in now. I know you've dabbled in philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, now history, philosophy. I guess what's your next project, and also what questions now in your career are you really hoping to get more into?
That's a good question. I guess it sort of happens as one gets older. You really want to think about your contribution, making what happens after you're gone a little bit better, right? So I'm very interested now in questions of moral philosophy, and why I think we know more in moral philosophy than we think we know. We think that so many things are still up to debate. I think that really is not true. And so actually, you mentioned the mind-body problem, which was my first novel. That was my first experiment. I got into a lot of trouble. Can you imagine? I mean, it's like a woman, philosophy of science, a young woman, small, blonde, young woman, in philosophy of science, not a woman anywhere in the vicinity. And to convince them how serious you are, you go and you publish a sexy novel. I mean, what an idiot, right? And before I had tenure. So this was a very stupid thing to do. But I actually find writing novels a very good way of thinking about philosophy, because the way I write novels, I don't know about other novelists, but the way I write novels is I completely get out of my own way of seeing things. I'm not interested in writing things from my own point of view. I already know what my own point of view is. I mean, what's the fun of that? So I'm interested in creating characters who see things very differently from I do. It's like my own little philosophy seminar, in my head, right? So that different points of view are there, arguing things out. So my character from that first novel, Renee Foyer, gave me the best idea I've ever had. I would not have had this idea on my own. And it was her notion of the mattering map. It's there in that novel. And many years later, about 20 years after I published that book, I was lecturing at Berkeley, and some professors told me, oh, you know, the idea of the mattering map has taken over in academia. There are, you know, and sometimes you're cited and sometimes you're not, because it was a novel, so they don't have to cite you, you know, only if it's a journal article do they have to cite you. So, and then I found out, you know, that there were people in behavioral economics who were using the idea of the mattering map. The mattering map has a tremendous amount of potential. I would not have discovered it on my own. Renee Foyer had discovered it. And so, because she thought differently from me, but it's the best idea I ever had. And then I discovered other people have taken. So I've started thinking about what I now call, or somebody else had named mattering theory. I wouldn't have come up with such a pompous name, but somebody else had called mattering theory, and it's about that. I think that our instinct for mattering, that we want to make our lives matter, that we are the animals who know we're going to die, and we want to make this brief time matter. We don't want to waste it. We don't want to squander it. Well, I think that's the deepest question in philosophy. I think that's the birth of philosophy. I think that's the birth of religion. And I think it's the birth of tragedy, right, of Greek tragedy. And so this question, you know, what can we do in order to make our lives matter? Are there facts of the matter about this? We are the creatures of matter who want to matter. And she had this idea of the mattering map. I mean, I've sort of developed this idea. That's what I'm working on, mattering theory.
On that note, we're going to thank Rebecca for a very stimulating talk.